YouTube. So this is my interview with Dr. James McDonald, who teaches in the English department at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I prepared an interview of about 16 questions. I've broken this interview up into 3 different sections. The first is kind of beginnings, that will discuss how Dr. McDonald became a professor, then a section on research, and then a section on pedagogy. So we'll start with the first question. First, thanks for letting me interview you.
Sure.
So first question is, where are you from, and how has your hometown shaped your identity as a researcher and teacher?
I lived in Hardin, Illinois until I was 10. That's a town of about 1,000 people on the Illinois River. I could actually see the Illinois River from my house when I went out the living room window. A farming community and a very it's a farming community in a county that is has a lot of bluffs and very small population. So that's right where the Illinois and Mississippi rivers come together.
Okay.
And there's not even a railroad mile or a half a mile of railroad track in it. So it's close to St. Louis, but rather isolated. And then I lived in other small towns of anywhere from 150 to 1,500 people, all in central and southern Illinois after that. How did that affect me? A small town, I think, gives you a certain perspective. Not most of the people in farming communities don't go to college.
Right.
Although, since both of my parents were graduates of college, I always expected to go. I think it's a very small town. Illinois is a very white business. When African Americans left the South to other parts of the country, they did not come to small town Illinois. Farms were not places where they could find jobs.
Right.
So I think there's a certain amount of isolation because of that, but also a desire to get out of the small town and see more of the world. I think that has some effect.
Okay. All right. And then what type of student were you in K through 12?
I was a strong student, and I was, in fact, valedictorian of my high school class.
Oh, okay.
So that was the largest school I went to. I had a mix of about half public education and half Catholic education. So I was particularly good at English, but also good at math.
Okay, yeah, I asked that question because there's always English professors that are great at English, and then math, they were not as diligent. But
no, math. I didn't like math and science as much as English, but I was good at it.
Okay, and then what type of student were you as an undergraduate?
I had a very successful undergraduate career, summa cum laude. So I was pre-med and dropped out that program my junior year, but I was doing English, majoring in English while I was still in the pre-med program.
I see.
And I wasn't doing. I just didn't like science enough to want to make that a career. And I got an opportunity, even at my senior year, to work with the Shakespeare scholar William McAvoy on the Variorum of Twelfth Night.
Oh,
so
okay.
I was doing kind of grunt research work in the library, but it was.
So you're talking about like manuscripts, right? The Variorum.
I was looking at. First, I was looking for criticism.
Oh, okay.
On Twelfth Night, so that and summarizing anything that I found. I was kind of having to do a flip through various journals just to look for references, because it might be that just a paragraph someplace might be something that McAvoy needed to look at and to refer to in the Variorum. Later on, I ended up collating editions. So then I would read Kittredge or edition or Bevington's edition or something like that, and any variations from the first folio.
Okay. All right, so the next question is probably the most straightforward one. Where did you receive your academic degrees?
Bachelor and master's degree at St. Louis University, PhD at University of Texas at Austin.
Okay. And so the next question, which scholars mentored you on the path toward becoming an academic?
Probably the first of importance was Brother Thomas Cass, who taught advanced placement English. So he eventually became a priest. He had a very intense advanced placement English course where we would have our class at the very end of the school day so that he could keep us there longer, maybe an hour or even an hour and a half longer. And he did that most of the time. And he was ambitious. He covered. We read Ulysses in that. We read I don't know at least half a dozen Shakespeare plays. Right? He was probably too ambitious, but it was. But you develop good note taking and good reading habits, I think, under that kind of pressure. And it was and he was a great guy. William McAvoy, because I worked closely with him. The big name at St. Louis University was Walter Ong.
Yes, the orality and literacy.
That's right. So I took 2 classes with him as an undergraduate and one as a graduate student, and then worked as his secretary for a summer.
Oh, okay.
So he was actually president of the MLA when I was his secretary, and I think so that was exciting, right? I did not do well in his first class, and figuring out what I needed to do to step up my game was really important. And he remained. I kept in touch with him until his death. At Texas, James Canavy, who was my dissertation director, was a very big influence. His approach to things was different from Ong's, but they both had that kind of historical approach. James Berlin, he was only there for a year as a visiting professor, but he was a whirlwind.
Right.
He excited everybody at Texas, and I got him on my committee.
Oh, wow.
And that was great. Probably John Ruskowitz, who's probably best known for a lot of textbooks. I would say to some degree Jennifer Gianassi. Not an easy person to have a relationship with, but she was at Northern Illinois University when I was an instructor there, and I worked under her in some administrative positions. She was important. Pointed me in certain directions that were useful for me when I went to do my PhD work. And afterwards, probably Sharon Crowley as a mentor after as a young professional.
Okay. So the next question is about your writing process. Do you compose in longhand or on the computer, and do you see any benefits inherent to either way of writing?
I usually compose on the computer. And I think I have since I bought my first personal computer.
Okay.
I occasionally do longhand, usually because it's just not, a computer isn't handy. I find it easier to write longhand when I'm traveling, and if I'm writing or revising something longhand, that's easier. I don't know whether it makes a huge difference, except that I can work faster, and it may be useful to be that, or at times when I'm writing something out that it slows me down. But for the most part, I like to be able to write down my thoughts as they come to me, and not be slowed down by that. So and then word processing certainly makes it very easy to reorganize things and compare different versions, and so that's really very helpful.
Okay, well, you kind of touched on your alternative career path where you didn't pursue medicine, and you kind of talked about why, but why did you decide to do a PhD in English?
I couldn't think of anything I wanted to do besides that. I think that's the main thing. I loved reading. Almost everybody gets into English because they love to read.
Right.
I was always successful at writing, and I got fascinated by that. I think I briefly considered maybe using film instead of writing as my area, but practically speaking, there were lots of jobs. I knew there were going to be a lot more jobs in writing, and I didn't think film would have it anywhere near it, right? I think the job I watched the job market for English professors crash.
Right, like 1990 or so?
No, it was more like it first crashed around 1970, 72 when I was an undergraduate. And then people expected it to recover in time.
Right.
And it recovered to some degree in the 80s, but basically universities they were deciding not to replace people nearly as much, so to use adjuncts, part-time labor, that would be instead of hiring. So when the enrollments recovered, the job market did not recover nearly as much as people were hoping it would. So I did take a year off from academia to make sure this was what I wanted to do, and that just confirmed that there wasn't anything that I really had any passion for besides that. So then I went to Texas.
Okay, so we'll move on to the section on research. So what are your current research interests?
Well, over time, I would have to say I've always been interested in the history of rhetoric and the history of composition. It's probably because of when Canadian Berlin, but I've always been drawn to that. And my writings, some of them have been about classical rhetoric, more have been about 19th and 20th century composition. My dissertation was on the history of imitation, and looking at how imitation was taught in Greek and Roman rhetoric in ancient times, and then comparing that to 19th century and early 20th century composition, and then kind of looking to the future and looking at imitation in a way that wasn't just styles, right? But how that affected imitation was used to teach invention and creativity, how it was used to teach organization, how it was used or not used to teach voice, things like that. And then what its relationship was to other facets of teaching, like practice and theory, rules. Okay. That led me into writing about the research paper, because the research paper, I thought, at least before the computer and the World Wide Web, you were doing a lot of copying. And so I thought in other ways that was an assignment that involved a lot of imitation, at least in print culture. I think it's less so now, when you can just copy and paste.
Right.
But I thought it involved a lot of imitation in that, in not in just that way, but in other ways too. So I did a lot of work on the research paper. I when I became Writing Center Director at UL, I developed an interest in doing research on writing centers, and I've continued that over the years, even though it's been a long time since I've run a writing center. And I've done a lot of work on labor issues in composition, part-time and adjunct instructors especially, but also, but that also gets into graduate assistants. It gets into the work of administrators and,
of course,
and others, right, and the working conditions and attempts to improve them.
And just a question about that. So did you have to read those ancient texts in Greek and Latin or in translation?
I read them mainly in translation.
Okay. All right, so the next question is, how would you describe your theoretical approach to teaching composition? You know, like expressivist or critical pedagogy?
I see. When I was at Texas, I studied under Lester Fagley and James Berlin, and they, at that time, were promoting the classification system, right? Berlin especially. It would change every time he wrote about it, and who would be in it would change. It wasn't quite the written in stone, which is what it became, where everybody kind of were able to feel they could peg anybody. So, and Texas was really at the epicenter of social epistemic approaches, right? While Carnegie Mellon was the place that people did cognitive.
Right.
And those, right, expressivist, right, although I don't know any expressivist who likes that term. Elbow, Murray, all those, that was always there. And and Berlin really was starting to be critical of it at that point. And that was influential. So I certainly was interested and always have been in classical rhetoric, but you can't just adopt classical rhetoric as a sole approach to it. It's got to be brought into current times. And so, so I certainly, so kind of I was influenced by various new rhetorics of the 20th and 21st century as well, but I probably use the concepts of classical rhetoric to get into things, and then we'll use, Latin, some feminist, maybe a little bit of critical pedagogy to help inform what I was doing.
Okay, so you talked about your doctoral dissertation, but did you do a master's thesis? And if so, what was that about?
I did not write a master's thesis, and I was in a traditional literature program. At St. Louis University, actually, like a lot of Jesuit universities, and I would say a lot of Midwestern universities had an interest in rhetoric, right? Even when it wasn't for much of throughout the 20th century to some degree. And so I was learning about rhetoric from Ong and from McAvoy in my philosophy classes, in my history classes, in some of them. So I was getting a rhetorical instruction, and that was having an effect, but it was typically kind of a rhetorical approach to literature. And so except for a course on teaching composition, I didn't really study rhetoric until I took a course from Jennifer Gianassi.
What you said about the strength of rhetoric programs in the Midwest, that is really true. I always wondered why that is.
I'm not sure. Ong has talked a little bit about that in an interview, but okay. I don't think he offered a reason. But I think he was thinking about the University of Chicago,
right?
Fred Newton Scott at Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, where T.W. Baldwin, who had a very rhetorical approach to the study of Shakespeare.
Okay.
Okay, and McAvoy, he was McAvoy's dissertation director. So it was spread among various public and private universities, but I don't know why.
Okay, so the next question is, what makes a piece of research useful to the field of rhetoric and composition, in your opinion?
Well, when I was studying rhetoric as a graduate student, rhetoric was about always had to have a classroom or curricular application, right? Whatever you were studying. So if we're studying history, you might be studying history to understand how we got to where we are and what we're teaching, or you might be studying history in part to find alternatives to what we're doing now, or you might be, studying persuasive text in order to have a deeper understanding of teaching of argument, so you can teach argument. And I like the potential practical use of that. And I like the fact that if I give a paper or write an article, it might change people's practices. And that extended into my writing center research, looking at how writing tutors are trained, looking at how writing center directors are treated in an English department, and improvements that could be made there. And it certainly was part of my interest in labor conditions, is to change things and help change things in some ways. It's not the only thing, but I have not moved too far away from teaching and curricular concerns in my research. I can do research that is simply rhetorical criticism. It's never interested me enough by itself, because it lacks that whatever kind of impact it's going to have in a practical way is harder to see.
I agree with you. Just because there's so few readers in any given academic field, I think that's also part of it. All right, so let's move on to the final section, which is on pedagogy. So what are the primary skills that a writing teacher must have?
Flexibility is one. An ability to read students, read the classroom, so you can make adjustments. You need to be able to work with students individually. I think conferencing is one-on-one conferencing is important and valuable. Working with small groups is important. Mixing things up in the classroom. As far as kind of planning, you kind of have to think about the different kinds of writing and audiences and genres that you want to have students work in, and how you can develop their ability to plan and pre-write, right? How you can improve their revising and not ignoring the proofreading, but not getting carried away with that. So you have to be how you respond to student papers, particularly drafts, is very important.
Okay. And what is the most satisfying thing about teaching?
I think if you have a student who really, when students start to feel successful, with whether they see themselves growing as writers in a class, or even if they have success with one paper that they have and they recognize themselves getting better,
right?
Being able to write more intelligently or more effectively or persuasively or more creatively. Any of that, I think, is a pleasure of teaching writing.
Okay, so basically seeing student improvement.
I think so.
Okay. And what is the most difficult part of teaching?
Grading. It's time consuming. And I've never been fast at it. I'm less fast at it than I was. It's hard to know, particularly written comments. It's hard to know when you're writing enough and when you're writing too much.
Right.
When you're not writing enough at all, right? Getting the right comment that is useful rather than something that's going to be misunderstood or take the student in the wrong direction or affect their confidence as a writer in negative ways rather than positive ways. That's the most difficult part, and it's tedious work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And finally, last question. Which theorists or scholars do you try to emulate in your classroom?
Oh, in my classroom? I don't know. I think recently, Sharon Crowley, probably, although I can't say I've ever seen her in the classroom. Right? Trying to think who else. If I'm looking at my writing center work, it's been a while, but I would say Muriel Harris probably was the most people would say, at least of a certain generation. Ong was a good teacher, and I think I probably emulate some of his things, but there's others when that I did his practices that wasn't for me. Kanavi was kind of a boring lecturer, but he was super organized and could really present ideas. I think that was influential. I end up using books by Wendy Bishop, by Peter Elbow. So some of the expressionists, right, they were really good at the classroom. You can even see that in the books that they wrote. So I think, as far as kind of dealing personally with students, some of people like Elbow and Murray and McCrory, I think they're influential.
Okay, so we're all out of questions, so I want to thank Dr. McDonald for this interview, and thanks for watching YouTube.